What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question sat in her mouth like cold iron. She tasted it every time she pushed the gate open. It was late November. The air had that thin, honest cold that makes everything sound farther away. Frost stitched the grass into tiny silver seams. The stable smelled of old hay and the faint, stubborn smoke from a heater someone had left on because nights were getting crueler. Wind found the cracks and whispered through the boards. She moved like someone learning her hands again, little motions, tucking a stray hair behind her ear, kneeling without thinking to pick up a dropped glove. She didn't say she missed him. She didn't talk much at all. Her grief lived in shorthand. A careful touch to a saddle, a plate left untouched, a mug rinsed and put away upside down so it looked like there was someone else in the house. The horse waited inside the low-walled stall with the feed bucket tucked to one side like a private altar. He stood in the doorway, half shadow, half mourning. Mixed breed. Broad shoulders that still remembered labor. His coat had the dull softness of winter knocking at it. Not the high-polished sheen of show stables, but honest, useful hair. Bits of straw clung to his fetlocks like memory. He had a scar along one flank, pale and mapped, a place where work had pressed too hard, or a rope had taught him pain. One ear turned toward the door, the other stayed listening to the rafters. His breathing was slow and deliberate. Horses breathed like metronomes. That first inhale felt like a map of where he had been and what he still would not say. She paused at the threshold, boots making the sound of small, private announcements on the concrete. He didn't snort or startle. He only drew his head back, slightly, and blinked, the way animals do when they are measuring an unknown. She had not meant to keep him. Nobody tells you that grief leaves you making bargains you never agreed to. The farm had been part of their life in 100 practical, quiet ways. When he died, when the person she shared everything with stopped breathing, there were forms and calls and small, unbearable practicalities. The horse had been in the paperwork, an afterthought boxed in with bank numbers and a funeral plan. She could have signed the papers and watched him load onto a trailer headed for somewhere that smelled of money and fear. Instead, she had signed her name and wrote another number. $80. It was the only amount the man who sold him would take without asking why. $80 to keep someone alive. She did not think of it as charity. She thought of it as a promise. He waited as if he already knew. She stepped into the stall slow, enough to let the air and the animal read one another. Her palms smelled of hand soap and the faint tang of tea. The horse's nostrils flared, wet and dark. He reached out first, curious, not trusting, but curious. His muzzle brushed her sleeve. The sensation was neither cinematic nor clean. It was warm and a little rough, like paper rubbed against skin. His eyes were honest. One held a small flatness near the top where the light did not quite reach. He looked as if he had learned to do without certain kinds of brightness. She read, that without trying. She had learned the language of absence. She crouched, letting the cold climb her knees. Her breath made small clouds between them. He watched. A horse listens with his whole body. Ear twitches, a shift in weight, the soft click his teeth made when he closed his mouth and thought to himself. He let her come close enough to feel his flank press against her thigh, a radiating warmth spilling. In the spaces grief had frozen. She had not expected to feel this immediate a betrayal of her loneliness. The horse's breath was oddly intimate. It sounded like living. It sounded like a clock being wound inside a body that still had work to do. Hey, she said, the word a thin ribbon. It was not a name. It was a hand offered. He snuffled, then made a sound low in his throat. A nicker, if you listen like someone who knows the sounds. He moved his head, gentle, testy, then leaned his temple against her shoulder like he had been practicing that press against people he trusted for years. A horse's head is heavy. It's a weight that insists on bearing. When it settled on her shoulder, something in her knees forgot how to stand upright. There was nothing theatrical about it. No swelling music. Just the clink of a feed bucket left on the floor and the faint creak of an old hinge. She felt the horse's breath on her collarbone and the terrible, honest truth. Something in her was still allowed to soften. She thought about leaving the gate open and letting him walk away. It would have been easier. Easier to keep the distance grief had carved out. Easier to be tidy about the memory of the man who was gone. Instead, she stroked the horse's neck, hand moving in the short, factual rhythm you use with a living thing that will either hurt you or help you. His skin was warm and a touch rough where the winter coat was coming in. His mane was pulled to one side like a stubbled crown. She found the line of his jaw, the place where his nerves felt close to the skin. Horses know where to stand, and how, close is honest. He closed his eyes for a half-breath, then opened them again. One ear turned to the rafters. The other kept trained on her as if he were expecting to be the one to be told what to do. She remembered the first time the man had brought him home. A laugh of disbelief, a photograph she kept folded in a drawer for nights when the house felt too big. Back then, the horse had seemed like a joke the two of them could afford. A work animal with no pedigree and all the heart of something bred for stubbornness. They had called him everything at once: mule, plow, fool. They had never called him a story. Not in the beginning. Now he seemed less like a punchline and more like a ledger. Things to be accounted for, things to be tended. Her fingers found a scar and she traced it slowly, like reading a sentence. He shuddered, a small ripple under her palm, not from fear, but from the background of long labor and sudden changes. She learned his ways in small doses. He was a marshaller of moods. When she hummed without thinking, he stepped closer. When she stood too long staring at a wall, he nudged at her palm as if to remind her to move. He hated sudden noises. A dropped metal lid would make him blink and swish his tail, but he didn't bolt. He had known worse and chosen steady. They found each other's rhythms. Mornings became rituals: feed, blanket, brush, a slow walk around, the paddock that smelled faintly of wet earth and horse urine, and the memory of a summer they might never see again. She spoke to him in phrases that never needed answers, and he answered anyway with the tiny language of animals: a lick, a chew, a deliberate step in time with her feet. His trust was not a gift so much as a decision he made each day by staying. There were nights she sat on the hay bale and let the dark pull at her. The horse would stand in the doorway and watch her like a clock watching a person's pulse. At some point, she began to understand that his presence did not take away the missing. It reframed it. Missing could be present and still not be lonely. But there were mysteries wrapped around him like old tack. He would sometimes freeze at the sound of a woman's voice in a television, ears swiveling as if remembering some particular key of tone. He avoided a certain corner of the field where a single, half-rotten stump made the grass grow thin. Once she found a scrap of twine tucked into his mane, knotted in a way she recognized from a tool belt the man had used. Sometimes, on windless afternoons, he would stare at the horizon and make a small, unfamiliar whinny, a sound like a question he would not get an answer to. She began to catalog these things, not because she wanted to solve a puzzle, but because cataloging offered the illusion of control. She made lists in her head: likes, dislikes, oddities. It kept her hands busy in the way grief will let you be practical when the rest of you is breaking. And still there was a question that sat quietly under everything. Was he simply a horse they had rescued from being sold for slaughter, or was he a relic carrying secrets she had not yet learned to read? She would leave the stall to fetch a bucket, or the brush, or a woven blanket that smelled faintly of his old owner, and when she turned back, he would follow. Not close, not demanding. Just behind her like a thought that had found its way into the room. She had no name for him yet. Names feel like commitments, and she did not trust herself with that kind of promise. So for the first weeks, he was the horse. The man who had been her partner had a name she could speak without permission. He did not. Saying his name meant admitting the permanence of loss. For now she kept silence and let the horse fill the space between breaths. One late morning, with frost still clinging to the edges of things, she slipped out, leaving the stall door cracked. She walked 2 steps, then looked back to make sure he was still there. He was, head in the doorway, ears tilted, nostrils flaring. He watched her with a patience so ordinary it became its own kind of miracle. She did not expect him to move. She did not expect anything at all. She had learned, cruelly, that expectation often ended in more absence. She closed the gate behind her and paused on the path, feeling the weight of everything that had shifted in the last months. When she turned to leave, he followed. Not running, not panicking, just following, hoof-falls soft in the mud. She didn't know why. She didn't know if it was hunger, curiosity, habit, or some memory lodged in the lines of his bones. She only knew that, for the first time since the funeral, the sound of another living creature moving beside her felt like less of a threat and more like a promise with teeth. She found the envelope the way grief hides the hard truths, tucked, where routine kept its secrets. It was behind the saddle's knee roll, folded flat by years of sweat and a farmer's care. Leather softened it like a palm. She didn't mean to look. She was cleaning, an endless thing that lets your hands believe they are doing something when your heart cannot. The tack room smelled of oil and bridal soap. Dust hung in the light like small, slow things waiting to be forgiven. Her name was written on the flap in a hand she knew the way you know a scar. For a moment her fingers were only numb instruments. She sat on the hay bale because her knees finally obeyed, and that was how the rest of the world slid into place. The envelope felt like the wrong size for whatever it might hold. When she slid the paper out, it was a single page, creased once, twice. It said, plain and small, "If anything happens, look after him. He's harder to place than he looks." No flourish, no dramatics. His handwriting had always been economical, like a work glove. Practical, with the familiar slant she could have traced in the dark. She read it twice, then a third time, because the third time is always the one that lets you know whether paper and breath will stay the same. There were other lines she had not expected. A note about a corner of the field that had to be fenced off in spring. A scribbled number for a farrier, and at the bottom, a sentence that seemed to set fire to a kind of slow, careful grief. "If I'm not here, don't sell him. He's worth more than $80. The air in the tack room left her lungs like someone had opened a window, in a room she had been holding her breath inside. She did not sob at first. Jerks, small ragged exhalations, escaped her. The kind of grief that arranges itself around practicalities. Where things will be put. How to feed a horse with no manual in the drawers. Then the dam broke in a small domestic way. Tears came, heavy and honest, and she let them fall because the saddle smelled of him, and because paper is sometimes the last place a man will spell his intentions. Outside the tack room, the horse had been a quiet witness. He stood with his head over the stall door, ears angled toward the sound of her breath. When she stepped out, the paper crumpled in her fist. He watched her with the same steady attention he gave a fence post or a bucket. No spectacle. No sudden gallop. Horses do not perform for pain. They register it. She did not have control over the sound she made when she finally let herself cry. It was not loud. It was small and private, and the horse leaned his weight into the board between them like a hand. He made that soft nicker again, low and concerned, and set his nose against the inside of her elbow. The warmth of him was the kind of medicine that does not promise to work, but arrives anyway. He stayed when the hay bale shook under her body. He stayed when her hands, trembling, smoothed the crease in the paper, as if it were something breakable and sacred. He stayed as if being present could be a kind of pledge. There is a moment in grief when facts collide with memory, and the body remembers what the mind has been too courteous to allow itself. She remembered the mornings when he would whistle into a mug of coffee and talk to the horse like the animal could answer in sentences. She remembered the half-finished projects in the garage, and the way he would come home smelling of oil and earth and the faint, stubborn happiness of a man who believed a horse could be fixed with patience and a rope. She wept not only for the man she had lost, but for the quiet workings of the life they had planned. The envelope, in its tiny, practical words, was a map back to him. When the crying eased into a slow, exhausted shaking, the horse pushed his forehead into her shoulder. Horses often lean when they want to be close. They press their weight because their bodies translate intention into pressure. He nudged the envelope between her hands with his nose, then backed away like he had done what he could, and now expected her to do the rest. She laughed in the way people will when grief and a small, impossible tenderness meet. It was a little sound that had both salt and relief. She folded the paper and tucked it into her coat. It felt like a relic small enough to keep. In the days that followed, The note became both anchor and ache. She reread the careful lines like someone studying a map. Each instruction he had left was practical, loving in that straightforward way he had always been. New shoes in April. Check the flank for that old nick. Don't let him near the wild apple. It makes him fidget. The final line, "He's worth more than $80, was both joke and appeal. She did not know whether to laugh at his blunt thriftiness or to mourn the way he had thought of price and worth as separate things. The horse, for his part, seemed to understand less of the specifics and more of the weather of her state. Horses are attuned to small rhythms, how fast you breathe, whether your voice tightens. He adapted. He stopped the nervous pacing at night, and instead stood where light seeped through the stable planks and watched the house. He would sometimes catch her eye and hold it like a conversation that did not need words. Then the other discovery happened. A reveal, gentler and stranger. On a late afternoon, weeks after the letter, the horse began to behave in a way she had noticed before, a small compulsion around an old stump at the edge of the paddock. The grass near the stump wore thin, as if it had been worried at by hooves for years. He would pause there and breathe in a way that made his flank rise and fall like a bellows. She had been watching him, clipboard in hand, listing things that made him uneasy because that was what people do when they try to order a life. He pawed once, an impatient, deliberate paw, then again harder. Horses paw when they are bored, when they are hungry, when they are annoyed. They also paw when something under the dirt smells like kin. He pawed until the hoof struck something. That rang hollow. The sound made her move without thinking. Together they uncovered a rusted tin. It came out in bits, flaking orange in time. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had made its way through years untouched, was a photograph and a small, tough notebook. The photograph was of the man, handsome in a way that made her heart ache, leaning against the very horse who now stood, watching. He was younger, his jaw less weary. He grinned like someone who had just won the small but satisfying argument with the world. On the back, in a hurried scrawl, 3 words. My stubborn friend. The notebook held lists. Names of farriers, notes about a vet who had fixed a lemonitic season, sketches of jumps and the way a horse's shoulder ought to meet a rail, pages of his handwriting. Practical obsessions that read, when put together, like a life built in small increments of care. She read until the paddock folded into a late gold hour. She read until the wind made the pages move, and the horse drifted his nose into the notebook as if to smell the oilcloth and claim it. He would not leave her side. He stayed and let the evening settle around them. That night she slept without the exactness of grief, not healed, not whole, but the knot inside her loosened enough that she could imagine mornings that were not only record-keeping and mourning. Weeks stretched. The farm learned a new rhythm. She learned to clean shoes and sign for hay deliveries and make small conversations with the postman. The horse learned to meet her half-step when she tightened the girth. They learned one another's signals, a slight squeeze of thigh, a murmured word, a hand that rested in clear, steady places. Months from the envelope and the tin and the photograph, the paddock began to look less like a place frozen between 2 events, and more like a place where something else could happen. They began, quietly, to practice. Not the ostentatious, crowded show arenas she had once watched from the edges of television frames, but small, sensible courses of rails and poles, built with scrap wood and care. He surprised her. Where he had been a plow horse, his shoulders remembered something athletic, a willingness to lift, a balance when the line asked him for it. She watched him clear the first rail with a kind of wonder that tasted like guilt and pride braided together. The jump was small, almost apologetic. He sailed it like a man who had not been asked before, and then found that he liked the asking. One evening, after a run that left his sides bright and sweating, and the breath between them heavy with work, she sat on the fence and let the barn lights paint him in an honest, constructive light. He stood, head lowered, breathing slow and deliberate. He had the look of creatures who have been given a second plan and decided to accept it. She slipped a hand along his neck and remembered the note at the bottom of the saddle, worth more than $80, and thought of what worth meant now. It had less to do with money, and more to do with the ledger of small commitments. Showing up, mending, feeding, holding a space long enough for healing to be patient. He nudged her hand and turned his head to look at her as if to say, without the clumsiness of human metaphors, that the job had always been to keep going. That sometimes keeping going is the most radical act of love left to you. They stood in the barnyard with the night folding its soft edges around the paddock. Crickets stitched time into the dark. Somewhere inside the house a kettle clicked as, if on cue, and she, once convinced she'd been only a housekeeper of memories, felt, for the first time in a long while, that she might be the keeper of a future too. If this story touched you, if you felt the slow work of two beings learning to carry each other, subscribe. Leave a comment about a time someone or something surprised you into hope. Follow for more stories, and press the bell so you can be here the next time a quiet life changes in the most unlikely way.